"Dad, she burned our gifts again." Lauren's voice trembled so much she could barely form the words, and her brown eyes, so much like the mother she'd lost 4 years ago, were dry from crying too much. Liam was beside her, hugging his twin sister, his glasses mended with duct tape sliding down his nose as he watched the flames consume the last box. The heat from the white marble fireplace contrasted with the chill gripping Richard Miller's chest as he stood in the entrance of the living room, his leather briefcase falling to the polished floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the entire mansion. Snow battered the panoramic windows, each flake dancing to the rhythm of the colored lights on the 12-foot Christmas tree, which blinked indifferently at the tragedy unfolding at its feet. Isabella Croft held the iron poker with the same casual grace she held her glass of French wine, turning slowly as she sensed her husband's presence. Her white silk dress shimmered under the Christmas lights, her platinum blonde hair falling perfectly over her shoulders, her blood-red nails gripping the tool tightly as she shoved another box into the flames. There was no guilt in her clear blue eyes, only irritation at being interrupted in the middle of her meticulous task. The Chanel perfume she wore mingled with the acrid smell of burning plastic, creating a nauseating combination that flooded Richard's nostrils as he tried to process the scene before him. The colorful boxes he had bought with such care 3 weeks ago were all there, piled next to the fireplace like common firewood. Liam's blue bicycle was disassembled in the corner, its parts tossed unceremoniously beside the grey velvet sofa. The doll that looked just like Catherine, the children's deceased mother, was in the middle of the flames right at that moment, its pink dress melting slowly as the porcelain face cracked from the intense heat. The video game console, which had cost $500, was reduced to a mass of molten plastic inside the hearth, along with books, new clothes, and all the other gifts Richard had personally chosen for his children. Richard felt his legs tremble, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there in the entryway of the house he had built with such pride. Helix, Isabella's 11-year-old son, was filming everything with his phone from the corner of the room, a nervous smile on his lips that slowly faded as he realized the gravity of the situation. Beatrice, Isabella's youngest daughter, was hidden behind the sofa with her hands covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut as if she wanted to disappear. Mrs. Helen, the housekeeper who had worked in the house for 15 years, watched from the kitchen doorway with tears streaming down her wrinkled face, her hands clasped in a silent prayer. The lost gifts were never lost. The phrase echoed in Richard's mind like a cruel mantra, unearthing memories he had pushed to the depths of his consciousness for 3 whole years. Every Christmas, every birthday, every special date when he asked about the presents, and Isabella replied with a tired sigh that the children had broken everything, lost everything, destroyed everything through sheer carelessness. He believed it because it was easier to believe, because he was always traveling, always working, always running from the pain of looking at his children and seeing Catherine reflected in every gesture, every smile, every tear. Now, standing there with his briefcase at his feet and extra gift bags in his hands, Richard saw the truth dancing in the flames of the fireplace like a mocking demon. Lauren tightened her hug on Liam, and the boy finally let out a small, quiet sob, a sound so small and contained it was heartbreaking. They were sitting on the cold marble floor, barefoot despite the harsh aspen winter, wearing simple, faded clothes that contrasted brutally with the designer outfits Felix and Beatrice wore. The twins' curly brown hair was unkempt, badly cut, as if no one had cared about their appearance in a long time. Lauren's hands, small and delicate like her mother's, were trembling visibly as she held her brother, and Richard noticed for the first time how calloused they were. Far too rough for a girl of only 9. The silence that followed was louder than any scream could be. Richard breathed heavily, the cold air burning his lungs as he tried to organize the thoughts exploding in his head like fireworks. Isabella remained standing by the fireplace, the poker still in hand, as if waiting for him to say something, do something, react in some way she could manipulate and twist to her advantage. The Christmas tree lights continued to flash, red, green, yellow and blue, each blink marking another second of a truth Richard had been too blind to see. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in a white blanket of false purity. Richard took one step forward, and then another, his Italian leather shoes resounding on the floor like drumbeats. His eyes, so tired from work, from travel, from running away, finally focused on his children with a painful clarity. He saw the marks on Lauren's arm that her long sleeve couldn't completely hide, saw the way Liam hunched his shoulders as if expecting a blow at any moment, saw the fear mixed with hope in both their eyes. He had failed them in ways he couldn't even imagine yet, but at that moment, for the first time in 4 years, Richard Miller was completely present. The packages he held in his hands fell to the floor with a dull thud, rolls of colorful wrapping paper scattering across the marble. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his own ears, drowning out all the other sounds in the house. The question he needed to ask was stuck in his throat, heavy as lead, because deep down he already knew the answer, already saw the truth dancing in the flames consuming his children's dreams. Isabella opened her mouth to speak, probably to weave another of her carefully crafted lies, but Richard raised his hand in a gesture that silenced her immediately. "What is going on here?" The words came out low, dangerous, laden with a fury as cold as the snow falling outside. Richard didn't shout. He didn't need to, because the tone of his voice said everything that needed to be said. Isabella blinked once, twice, and then her face composed itself into that perfect mask of the dedicated wife she wore so well. "Richard, you're home early. What a wonderful surprise." Her voice was honey and venom at the same time, sweet on the surface, but rotten underneath. She dropped the poker, which landed with a metallic clang, extending her arms as if to hug him, as if nothing was wrong, as if the world wasn't collapsing around them. Richard took a step back as Isabella tried to approach, his eyes fixed on the flames still consuming what was left of the gifts. "Are those the gifts I bought?" His voice was firmer now, each word heavy with the realization of what he had witnessed. Isabella froze mid-movement, her arms still extended in the air for a second, before she let them fall to her sides with practiced grace. "Oh, this?" The children were fighting over the toys, broke everything before they even used them properly. She shrugged as if she were talking about the weather, as if destroying Christmas gifts was perfectly normal and justifiable. "I'm just discarding the trash, darling. You know how irresponsible these children are with things." These children. She always referred to Liam and Lauren as these children, never by their names, never as her stepchildren, never with any trace of affection or belonging. Richard felt the pieces click further into place, each part of the puzzle fitting together with brutal clarity. He looked at the twins, still huddled on the floor, their small bodies trembling slightly, and saw how they avoided looking directly at Isabella, as if she were the sun, and they feared being blinded. "Is that true?" Richard asked Lauren directly, his voice softening only a fraction as he addressed his daughter. "Did you break the gifts?" Lauren opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she glanced quickly at Isabella before bowing her head again. Liam tried to speak, his mouth moving in frustrated attempts as the stutter that had plagued him for years intensified under the pressure of the moment. We... He couldn't form the words, his breathing accelerating in panic. Isabella crossed her arms over her chest, a perfectly drawn eyebrow arched in silent triumph. "See, they can't even deny it, Richard. I spent the entire afternoon cleaning up the mess they made, and this is how I'm treated in this house." Beatrice emerged from behind the sofa like a small, frightened ghost, her 8 years seeming much younger under the weight of what she was about to do. "Daddy Richard," It wasn't like that. Her voice was a whisper that cut through the air like a blade. Isabella whipped around so fast her hair flew in a golden arc, the blue eyes that always seemed so soft now hard as ice. "Beatrice, go to your room, now." The voice was sharp, dangerous, and for the first time Richard saw his wife without any disguise, without any pretense of sweetness or civility. It was the tone she used with his children when she thought no one was listening. But Beatrice, for the first time in her short life, didn't obey. "No, you're lying. The presents weren't broken." Her cheeks were red, her hands clenched into tiny fists at her sides. Felix dropped his phone on the sofa and stood up, nervous. "Shut up," he muttered. But there was no conviction in his words, only fear of the consequences. Beatrice ignored her brother, her eyes fixed on the stepfather she barely knew, who was always traveling, always absent, but who was her only hope at that moment. Mom took the presents out of the boxes and... She swallowed hard, gathering courage. "And she burned them. The presents were perfect, new. She burned them because she wanted to." The silence that followed was so thick, it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Richard felt something inside him shatter, a crack that started small but spread like spiderwebs through his very soul. He looked at Isabella, really looked, and saw a stranger where he once thought he had a wife. How many times? The question came out hoarse, loaded with a pain he didn't even know he could feel. "How many times have you done this, Isabella?" She laughed, a humorless sound that echoed in the room like breaking glass. "Done what?" "Educate your children. Someone has to do it, Richard, since you're always too busy to be a real father." The accusation hit Richard like a punch to the gut, because it held a grain of truth he couldn't deny. He was always busy, always traveling, always using work as an excuse to avoid facing the pain of being home without Catherine. But this, whatever this was, went far beyond his absence. "Educate!" His voice finally rose, the contained fury beginning to overflow. "Burning Christmas gifts is education." Isabella took a step forward, her perfectly made-up face twisting into something ugly and true. "They don't deserve them. They live to disrespect me, to ignore me, always reminding you of that woman. That woman." Isabella spat the words as if they were poison, and Richard felt the world stop. She was talking about Catherine, the mother of his children, the woman he had loved more than life itself, and who had fought until her last breath to stay with them. "You don't talk about her," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous again, each word measured and precise. Isabella laughed again, a hysterical, uncontrolled sound. "Why not? Because she's a saint? Because she's perfect? She's dead, Richard, dead, and I am here, alive, trying to make this family work, while these children sabotage me at every turn." Richard knelt beside the fireplace, ignoring the heat that seared his face. He grabbed the poker Isabella had dropped and began to shift through the ashes and still smoldering remains. Every piece he found was clear, undeniable evidence. The packages had been intact before being burned, the store seals still visible on some fragments that survived the flames. There were no signs of broken toys, of careless use, of anything that supported Isabella's lie. Everything was new, perfect, carefully destroyed not by childish hands, but by an adult woman driven by something so dark Richard still couldn't fully comprehend it. He stood up, holding a piece of packaging that still showed part of the barcode from the store where he'd bought the gifts. The memories began to surface like a relentless flood. Last Christmas, when Liam cried because his new bike had disappeared and Isabella explained it was probably stolen from the garage. Lauren's birthday, when the doll she wanted so badly vanished the next day, and Isabella suggested maybe the girl had lost it in the garden. Every gift, every special occasion, every disappointment in his children's eyes that he had ignored because it was easier to believe in accidents than to face the monstrous truth now dancing in the flames before him. Richard turned slowly to the twins, still kneeling on the cold floor, and for the first time in years, he truly saw them. He didn't just look. He saw who they were, what they had become, what they had suffered in silence while he fled to work like a coward. "Liam, Lauren, look at me." His voice was shaky, heavy with an emotion he had buried deep since Catherine's death. "Please, tell me the truth. Has this happened before?" The twins looked at each other, a silent communication only such close siblings can share. And then Lauren nodded slowly, the tears finally streaming freely down her pale cheeks. "Every Christmas, Dad." Lauren's voice was a thin, brittle thread, about to snap at any moment. "Every birthday, every special day. She burns them, throws them away, hides them. She says we don't deserve them because... Her voice failed, and she hid her face in her brother's shoulder. Liam took a deep breath, squeezed his eyes shut, and for the first time in months he managed to speak without stuttering, as if his father's presence gave him a courage he thought he'd long lost. "Because we killed Mom." The words came out in a whisper, laden with a pain so deep Richard felt his legs weaken again. The world stopped. Completely. Richard couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he had just heard. "Because you what?" The words came out harsh, incredulous, as if his brain refused to accept what his ears had heard. Lauren lifted her face, and Richard saw there not just the pain of a child, but the corrosive guilt that someone had planted in her with such cruelty that it had taken deep root in her soul. "She said, if we hadn't been born, Mom wouldn't have gotten sick. That you work so much because you can't stand to look at us, because we remind you of what you lost because of us." Richard staggered as if he'd been physically struck, his hands reaching for the back of the nearest sofa for support. Isabella had used Catherine's death, the deepest and most sacred pain of his life, as a weapon against innocent children who had already lost their mother. Liam continued, the words pouring out in a flood that seemed impossible to stop now that it had begun. "She said one day you're going to send us away, to an orphanage, because we're just bad memories. That her kids are the real family and we're just burdens. That we don't deserve presents, don't deserve good food, don't deserve anything because we took Mom away from you." Richard's legs finally gave out, and he fell to his knees on the cold floor, the impact reverberating through the entire room. His eyes filled with tears for the first time since Catherine's funeral, hot tears that burned his cold face. "No," he whispered, his voice broken into 1,000 pieces. "No, no, no. You didn't kill anyone. Your mother had cancer. She was sick long before you were born. The doctors explained that 1,000 times. She loved you more than anything in this world. She fought to stay here for you." He extended his trembling arms, and the twins ran to him finally, their small bodies crashing against their father's chest in a hug that had been denied for far too long. Richard held them tightly, feeling them tremble against him, years of pain and rejection, finally finding a safe harbor. "I'm so sorry," he repeated like a mantra, his voice muffled by the children's curly hair. "I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I let this... He couldn't even say the word. Such was the fury and disgust he felt. Lauren sobbed against his chest, her small body shaking violently. "We just wanted you to stay, Dad, that's all. We don't need expensive presents or nice clothes or anything. We just wanted you here." Isabella watched the scene with an expression that mixed contempt with growing panic. She could feel control slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers, could see the charade she had so carefully constructed over 3 years, crumbling like a house of cards. "What a touching scene," she said, her voice dripping sarcasm like acid. 3 years without you caring, Richard, and now suddenly you're Father of the Year." Where was this concern when I was here alone, dealing with traumatized, ungrateful children who refused to accept me? Where were you when I needed support? Richard lifted his face, his red-rimmed eyes locking on Isabella with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step back. You never had to deal with traumatized children, Isabella. You created the trauma. His voice was low again, but there was an absolute certainty in it, an understanding that was forming in ever more terrifying layers. Felix, who had remained silent until then, got up from the sofa, the phone trembling in his hands. "Mom, stop, please, just stop." His cheeks were wet with tears, and for the first time he looked his actual age, a scared, confused 11-year-old. Isabella turned on her son, fury in her eyes. "Felix, shut your mouth and go to your room now." But Felix shook his head, his hands clutching the phone as if it were a life raft. "You said it was just to scare them, Mom, that it wasn't supposed to really hurt. You promised." Richard gently released the twins and stood up, his eyes fixed on the boy holding the phone, as if it contained something important. "Felix, what are you holding?" Felix looked at his mother, then at Richard, and then made a decision that would change everything. "I filmed it. I have videos. I thought it was just a game at first, but give me that phone." Isabella's voice came out sharp as a razor, and she took a step toward her son. "Now, Felix." But Richard was faster, placing himself between Isabella and the boy with a speed surprising for someone who had been on his knees seconds ago. "Felix, can you show me?" The boy hesitated for only a second before holding the phone out to Richard with trembling hands. "I'm sorry, Uncle Richard. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know it was this serious." Richard took the phone, his fingers swiping across the screen with a growing sense of horror as he saw the gallery full of videos, each one with dates stretching back almost 2 years. The first video Richard opened showed the mansion's dining room, filmed from a high angle, probably from Felix hiding on the stairs. The date in the corner read 15 months ago, and the audio began with Isabella's voice already raised. "You will stay locked in that room until you learn to respect me, understand?" The camera showed Liam and Lauren being pushed into the back bedroom, the one that used to be just for guests, but that Richard now realized had become his children's prison. 2 days without food will teach you not to contradict me in front of visitors." The door slammed shut, and then the video showed Isabella locking it from the outside with a key. Richard felt bile rise in his throat. 2 days. She had locked his children in a room without food for 2 days. His hands were shaking so badly, he almost dropped the phone as he swiped to the next video. This one was older, 14 months ago, and it showed Isabella in the living room, systematically tearing up photographs. Richard recognized the photos. They were the last ones they had of Catherine, the ones the twins treasured. "Your mother isn't here," Isabella said coldly as she ripped each photo into tiny pieces in front of Lauren, who was crying silently. "She left because she couldn't stand to look at you. Stop living in the past and accept that I am the mother now." The third video showed the kitchen. Lauren, only 8 years old, was on her knees on the floor with a toothbrush in her hand. The girl was scrubbing the massive floor, tile by tile, while Isabella stood over her, stopwatch in hand. "Faster! If you don't finish in 2 hours, you'll do it all again tomorrow. And no dinner tonight since you were too slow at breakfast too." Lauren could barely hold the brush, her small hands red and swollen from scrubbing. The video lasted 20 minutes, and Richard watched with growing horror as his daughter toiled like a servant, like less than a servant, like a slave in her own home. There was more. So much more. Video after video of humiliations, cruel punishments, and psychological abuse so systematic and calculated it could be nothing but deliberate. One showed Isabella serving a lavish dinner to Felix and Beatrice in the dining room, while Liam and Lauren ate cold leftovers in the kitchen, sitting on the floor like animals. Another showed her screaming at Liam for hours, calling him retarded, useless, a mistake of nature, until the boy curled into a fetal position in the corner of his room. There was one where she forced Lauren to throw away a letter the girl had written to her father, tearing the paper and making Lauren swallow the pieces while she laughed. The most recent one was from 3 weeks ago. Isabella was in the twins' room at night, and Richard recognized the pajamas they had been wearing the last time he was home. "Your father doesn't love you," she was saying with disturbing calm, sitting on the edge of the bed where the children were pretending to sleep. "He works so much because he can't stand to be near you. I am the only thing standing between you and an orphanage, understand? If I leave, you go to the streets. So you'd better start treating me with the respect I deserve." The camera showed Lauren squeezing her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face, while Liam bit his lip until it bled to make no sound. Richard couldn't watch anymore. He let the phone fall onto the sofa and covered his face with his hands, his entire body shaking with a mixture of rage, horror, and guilt so intense he didn't know if he could bear it. 47 videos, 47 pieces of evidence of the systematic torture of his children while he was too busy building skyscrapers and closing deals. Mrs. Helen appeared at the kitchen door, her clasped hands trembling visibly. "Mr. Richard," she began, her voice cracking, "I tried to tell you 3 times I tried, but she threatened me, said she would fire me without references, that she would destroy my reputation. I need this job. I have grandchildren to support. No." Richard held up a hand, cutting off the housekeeper's excuses. "No, Mrs. Helen, I'm not blaming you. I should have seen. I should have been here. I should have been a father." He looked at Isabella, who had retreated until her back was against the wall, her eyes furiously calculating a way out of this. "But there are no more excuses now. There are no more lies that will work, no more masks to wear. I saw everything, Isabella. Every second of the hell you created for my children." Isabella lifted her chin in defiance, but there was growing fear in her eyes. "They deserved every second," she spat. "You weren't here. You didn't see how they treated me, how they disrespected me." Richard took a step toward her and then another, each movement controlled despite the rage burning in his veins. "They are children, 9-year-old children who lost their mother and were left in the care of a monster while their coward father ran from his own pain." Isabella tried to move aside, but Richard blocked her path. "You used Catherine's death against them. You made innocent children believe they were responsible for their own mother's cancer. What kind of person does that?" Isabella laughed, a hysterical, uncontrolled sound. "A person who is tired of living in the shadow of a dead saint. A person who deserves to be loved, to be the priority, not always the second choice after ghosts and memories." "So that's it?" The realization hit Richard like a freight train. "Jealousy. You're jealous of a dead woman." Isabella didn't deny it. Her face twisted into something ugly and true. "And why shouldn't I be? You never loved me, Richard. You married me because you needed someone to take care of the house, the children, to fill the hole she left. But I was never good enough. I was never her. And these children, these damn children are always here, always reminding you of her, always in the way of my family getting what it deserves." She was screaming now, all refined composure completely gone. "And what does your family deserve, Isabella?" Richard asked with a deathly calm. "My inheritance, my money, is that why you tried to erase my children from the equation?" Isabella's eyes flashed with a wild fury, and for the first time she didn't try to deny it. Yes, it's about money. Did you think I was going to let 2 pathetic orphans get millions while my children have no guaranteed future? Felix and Beatrice are mine. They are the only thing that matters in this world. I did what I had to do to protect their future. If that meant making your little brats suffer a bit, then so be it. They would survive or they wouldn't. It wasn't my problem. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the snow outside seemed to have stopped falling. Felix had his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with horror at hearing his mother admit everything so coldly. Beatrice was crying openly, shaking her head as if she could undo the words she had just heard. Mrs. Helen made the sign of the cross, muttering a quiet prayer. And Richard simply looked at the woman he had married 3 years ago and saw a complete stranger, a cruel, calculating stranger who had systematically tortured his children for greed and pathological jealousy of a woman who wasn't even alive to defend herself. I want you to get your things and get out of my house. Richard's words came out low, but they carried the weight of a final, irrevocable sentence. Now, Isabella. Isabella laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound that echoed through the room like something broken. You can't kick me out, Richard. We're married, remember? This house is as much mine as it is yours. Richard kept his gaze fixed on her, unmoving as stone. Prenuptial agreement. You signed that in the event of a separation, you would have no right to any of my inheritance or properties acquired before the marriage. My lawyers will ensure you leave this house without a single penny you didn't bring with you. The color drained from Isabella's face like water down a drain. The agreement, she had signed it without reading it closely, so focused on securing the marriage that she hadn't paid attention to the legal details. Richard had always been careful with his assets, especially after building an empire from scratch. And my children, her voice came out shrill, desperate. Felix and Beatrice are your stepchildren now. They're family. Richard looked at the two young people, one still holding the phone that sealed his mother's fate, the other curled up on the sofa with her knees to her chest. They stay with me if they want to. You leave alone. Isabella took a step toward Richard, her hands outstretched in a plea that didn't match the coldness she had shown minutes before. Please, Richard. I know I went too far, but it was for their own good to discipline them to... Don't finish that sentence. Richard's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. Do not try to justify torture as discipline in front of me. You had 3 years to be human, 3 years to love children who had already lost everything. And you chose to systematically destroy them because you can't compete with the memory of a woman who was worth 1,000 of you. Isabella recoiled as if she'd been slapped, her face contorting in impotent fury. I will destroy you in court, she hissed. All veneer of civility finally cracked beyond repair. I'll tell everyone how you abandoned your children, how you were never present, how you left me alone to deal with traumatized kids. I will take half of everything you have, and I'll still get custody of Felix and Beatrice. You'll see. Richard picked up the phone from the sofa and held it up, the screen still showing the list of incriminating videos. You'll try, and I will show these videos to every judge, every lawyer, every person who needs to see them. Documented child abuse, Isabella, criminal negligence, psychological torture. You won't even get supervised visits by the time I'm done. The realization of what she had done, of what had been captured on video, finally hit Isabella with full force. She staggered, reaching for the wall behind her for support. Her eyes darted around the room desperately, searching for something, anything she could use to her advantage. Felix, tell him I never really hurt them, that it was all an exaggeration by these children. Felix looked at his mother, and Richard saw the exact moment something broke in the boy, when years of manipulation finally lost their power. I'm not going to lie for you anymore, Mom. What you did was wrong, so wrong. Isabella let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She looked at Beatrice, seeking the support her son had denied. Beatrice, honey? Tell them Mommy was just trying to do what's best, that sometimes we have to be tough to teach. But Beatrice shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her round face. You hurt them, Mommy. I saw it, I heard it, and I stayed quiet because I was scared. But I can't pretend it's okay anymore. I can't. The betrayal from her own children was the final blow, and Isabella crumbled against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, all arrogance drained from her body. Richard turned to Mrs. Helen, who was still at the kitchen door like a silent witness to everything unfolding. "Mrs. Helen, could you please call the community security and then help Isabella pack her bags? She has 20 minutes to get her personal belongings and leave." The housekeeper nodded quickly, relieved to have a clear task amid the emotional chaos. As she left to make the call, Richard finally allowed himself to look back at Liam and Lauren, still huddled in the corner, watching everything with wide eyes that mixed hope and disbelief, as if they couldn't believe someone was finally on their side. Richard walked over to them and knelt again, his expensive suit getting dirty on the floor without him caring in the slightest. "I need to see where you sleep." His voice was soft but determined. "I need to see everything she hid from me." Lauren and Liam looked at each other, a silent communication passing between the twins. "It's bad, Dad," Lauren whispered. "You don't need to see." "But I do need to," Richard insisted, holding out his hands to them. "I need to know everything. Every single thing she did, every lie she told, every bit of suffering she caused. I'm not running away anymore, I promise." The twins hesitated for only a second before taking their father's hands, their small, cold fingers lacing with his. The walk to the back bedroom seemed to take an eternity, each step heavy with the weight of guilt and realization. Richard barely remembered the last time he'd been in this part of the house, always so focused on his office or on preparing for the next trip. The door was plain, unadorned, contrasting starkly with the ornate doors of Felix and Beatrice's rooms they had passed in the hallway. When Lauren opened the door, Richard felt the air leave his lungs. The room was cold, literally freezing, and he realized the central heating didn't work in here. The window had a large crack in the glass, letting the cold aspen air flow in freely. There were two narrow beds with old, torn mattresses and thin blankets that were clearly not enough for the region's harsh winter. The walls were peeling in several places, and there were damp stains on the ceiling that indicated an old, unrepaired leak. The wardrobe was small and old, filled with mended, faded clothes that Richard barely recognized as the ones he'd bought years ago. There were no toys in sight, no childish decorations, nothing to indicate that 9-year-old children lived here. It looked more like a servant's quarters from decades ago than the bedroom of heirs to a real estate empire. Richard entered the room slowly, as if stepping on sacred ground, a shrine of suffering he had ignored for years. His hands trembled as he touched the nearest mattress, feeling the worn-out springs through the thin fabric. "How did I let this happen?" he murmured to no one in particular, his voice thick with a self-recrimination so heavy it felt physical. Liam tugged gently on his suit sleeve. "It's not your fault, Dad. You didn't know." But Richard shook his head violently. "I should have known. I'm your father. It was my responsibility to protect you, and I failed. Completely." Lauren walked over to her bed and, with hesitant movements, lifted the thin mattress. Underneath it was a hidden treasure, a collection of crumpled paper, letters written in irregular childish script, colorful drawings made with old crayons. "We wrote to you," she explained in a small voice, gathering the wad of papers with reverent care. "But Aunt Isabella always took the letters before you could read them, so we stopped trying to send them and started hiding them here." There were 23 letters, spanning 3 years. A part of Richard died in that moment, a part he would never get back. With trembling hands, Richard took the first letter from the top of the pile. The date in the top right corner read 3 years ago, just a few months after his marriage to Isabella. "Dear Dad, Aunt Isabella said you don't like us anymore because we remind you of Mom. Is that true? If it is, we can try to look different. We can cut our hair, change our clothes, anything. Just please don't send us away. I love you so much, Lauren." The words were written in the unsteady handwriting of a 6-year-old, some letters backward, but every word pierced Richard's heart like a poisoned arrow. He grabbed another letter, this one from 2 years ago. "Dad, I try not to stutter, but I can't. Aunt Isabella says you're ashamed of me for it. I'm going to practice a lot, I promise. I'll be a better son. Just come home soon. Miss you. Liam." Richard had to stop reading, squeezing his eyes shut as the tears finally flowed freely. Isabella had used every insecurity, every trauma, every open wound of these children and had rubbed salt in them, repeatedly. She had twisted the love they felt for their father into a tool of torture, making them believe that every flaw, every imperfection was a reason to be abandoned. One more letter from a year ago. "Daddy, Merry Christmas. Aunt Isabella said you weren't coming home this year, that you had more important things to do. But I saw your car pull up from the window. You came back. I wanted to give you a hug, but Auntie said you were tired and I should wait. I waited for 3 days, but you had already left again. It's okay. I understand. Work is important. I love you anyway. Lauren." Richard remembered that Christmas. He had returned for only a few hours to grab forgotten documents, hadn't even taken his bags out of the car. Isabella had said the children were sleeping, and he had believed her, leaving again without seeing his kids. There were letters for uncelebrated birthdays, for forgotten holidays, for broken promises and crushed hopes. Each letter was more devastating than the last, showing the gradual deterioration of childish hope into painful resignation. The last letter was from only 2 weeks ago. "Dad, I think Aunt Isabella is right. We probably did kill Mom. If we hadn't been born, she would still be here and you would be happy. We're going to try not to bother you anymore. Sorry for existing. Liam and Lauren." Richard couldn't read past those words, the paper falling from his hands as he completely broke down. He pulled both twins into a desperate hug, crushing them to his chest as if he could absorb all the pain they had felt, as if he could turn back time and undo every second of suffering. "You didn't kill anyone," he repeated like a mantra between sobs. "Your mother had cancer before you were born. The doctors explained that 1,000 times. She fought to stay here for you because she loved you more than anything. And I love you too, I always have, even when I was too much of a coward to show it. Never, ever think this was your fault." The children cried against him, years of pain finally finding an escape valve. Mrs. Helen appeared at the bedroom door, her pale face marked by her own tears. "Mr. Richard, security is here. Isabella is finishing packing." Richard quickly wiped his face, trying to regain some semblance of control, though he knew he was failing miserably. "I'll be right there." He looked around the room one last time, searing every awful detail into his memory so he would never forget the price of his absence. "Tomorrow, I'm calling contractors. We are going to demolish this room and build the best space you can possibly imagine. With heating, new windows, comfortable beds, everything. But Dad," Lauren protested weakly, "we don't need anything expensive." Richard knelt in front of her, cupping her small face in his hands. "I know you don't, but you deserve it. You deserve comfort, safety, warmth. You deserve to be treated like the precious children you are, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making up for these 3 horrible years." He turned to Liam. "And you will never again sleep cold or hungry or afraid. I promise you that." Liam nodded, still unable to speak, his hands clutching his father's shirt as if he feared he would disappear if he let go. Felix and Beatrice had followed them to the room and were now watching from the doorway, their faces white with shock. They had never been in here. Isabella had always kept this part of the house off limits to her own children. Seeing the contrast between their own luxurious rooms and this cold, miserable cubicle where their step-siblings were forced to live was like a slap in the face. "Uncle Richard," Beatrice said in a trembling voice. "Can we help? Can we do anything to make up for it?" Richard looked at her with an expression that mixed sadness and compassion. "You're already helping by telling the truth, by standing on the right side. That's more than many people do." The sound of an argument from the main living room brought them back to the immediate reality. Isabella was screaming at the security guards, her shrill voice echoing through the mansion's corridors. "I am the mistress of this house. You can't just throw me out like this." Richard straightened his shoulders, wiped his face one last time, and walked toward the final confrontation he knew was inevitable. The children followed him silently, a small procession moving through the house that would never be the same again. The smell of burning plastic still permeated the air, a physical reminder of the cruelty that had been exposed on this Christmas Eve. Isabella was in the middle of the living room, surrounded by 2 large suitcases and a handbag, her perfectly made-up face now blotchy from tears of rage and despair. 2 community security guards stood at a respectful but alert distance, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but determined to do their duty. When Richard entered the room with the children behind him, Isabella turned like a cornered animal, her red-rimmed eyes locking on her husband with a mixture of hatred and supplication. "You can't do this to me, Richard, to me. I am your wife. Do 3 years of marriage mean nothing to you?" Richard stopped a safe distance away, his body forming a protective barrier between Isabella and the children. 3 years, Richard repeated, his voice strangely calm given the storm of emotions he felt inside. 3 years in which you systematically tortured my children while I was too blind with guilt and work to see. 3 years in which you used their mother's death as a psychological weapon. 3 years in which you burned presents, destroyed memories, locked children in rooms without food, and made them slaves in their own home. He took a step forward, and Isabella unconsciously recoiled. "So no, Isabella, these 3 years mean nothing to me but shame and regret." Isabella let out a hysterical laugh that held no humor, only pure desperation. "I did everything for this family," she screamed, her hands gesticulating wildly in the air. "I kept this house running. I raised the children while you were too busy being the great businessman Richard Miller. I sacrificed my career, my life, everything to be the perfect wife you needed." Richard shook his head slowly. "You didn't raise my children, Isabella. You destroyed them piece by piece. And as for being the perfect wife, you were the perfect actress, the perfect mask of kindness covering a monster I never imagined existed." Mrs. Helen was in the kitchen, but Richard knew she heard every word, as did the guards who were trying to maintain neutral expressions. "So now what?" Isabella asked, her voice breaking into something between a shout and a sob. "You're just going to throw me on the street like trash? Where am I going to sleep tonight, Richard? It's Christmas Eve." Richard kept his expression impassive, though he felt a pang of something that might have been pity if it weren't overshadowed by the image of the letters hidden under the mattress. "There are several good hotels in town. You have credit cards. You have money in your own account that I haven't touched. You'll survive one night until you find a permanent place." Isabella took a staggering step, grabbing the arm of the sofa. "And my children? Are you going to separate me from Felix and Beatrice too?" Richard looked at the 2 young people standing behind him, Felix still holding the phone like an electronic testament to his mother's crimes, Beatrice with her eyes swollen from crying. "The choice is theirs," he said calmly. "If they want to go with you, I won't stop them. But if they want to stay here with me, they have that right as well." Isabella turned to her children with an expression that mixed desperate hope and authoritarian command. "Felix, Beatrice, get your things. We're leaving this house of ingrates now." Her voice had that tone that brooked no disobedience, the one they had known since they were small and that always made them obey without question. But something had changed. Felix looked at his mother, then at Richard, then at Liam and Lauren huddled in the corner. "I'm staying, Mom." The words came out low but firm, and Richard saw the exact moment Isabella realized she had lost control over her son. "What?" Her voice jumped 3 octaves. "Felix Robert Croft, you will come with me now, or you will regret it for the rest of your life." But Felix shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, Mom. What you did was wrong. So wrong. And I'm not going to be a part of it anymore." Isabella staggered as if she'd been physically struck, her hand flying to her chest in a dramatic gesture. "Beatrice!" Isabella's voice was almost pleading as she turned to her youngest daughter. "Honey, you're coming with Mommy, aren't you? You've always been Mommy's girl, remember?" Beatrice looked at her mother with eyes full of tears and something that looked a lot like disappointment. "I love you, Mommy," she said, her voice trembling, "but what you did to Lauren and Liam was horrible. They're just kids like me, and you were so mean to them. I don't understand why." Isabella held out her hands in a desperate plea. "I did it to protect you, to make sure you would have a future, an inheritance, everything you deserve." But Beatrice shook her head slowly. "That's not why, Mommy. It's because you were jealous. I heard everything you said." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Isabella looked around the room, at every face that met hers with only judgment and rejection. Her own children had abandoned her. Her husband was kicking her out. Even the housekeeper was looking at her with something close to revulsion. "You will all regret this," she finally said, her voice taking on a low, dangerous tone. "When you're all alone dealing with traumatized, problematic children, when you realize I was the only one holding this family together, you will beg me to come back." Richard took a step forward, his physical presence dominating the space between them. "We will never beg for you, Isabella. Never again." The security guards finally moved, picking up Isabella's suitcases with efficient professional movements. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us now," one of them said in a firm but not aggressive voice. Isabella glared at them as if they were personal traitors. "I know the head of this community personally. You will lose your jobs for treating me like this." The older guard simply shook his head. "We are following the orders of the property owner, ma'am. Mr. Miller has every right to decide who stays on his property. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Isabella looked around one more time, as if hoping someone would intervene, that someone would defend her. When it was clear no one would, she snatched her handbag with a sharp movement and walked toward the door with her head held high, trying to maintain some dignity amid the complete humiliation. But before she left, she turned one last time. "You are all a bunch of ingrates." She spat the words like venom. "I gave the best years of my life to this family, and this is how I'm treated? Like a criminal?" Richard said nothing, just watched as she was escorted out. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like a final punctuation mark on a terrible chapter that was finally ending. The house fell strangely silent after Isabella's departure. The Christmas tree lights continued to flash, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded beneath their decorated branches. The fireplace still held the smoking remains of the burned gifts, a silent witness to the cruelty that had been exposed. Richard looked around at the 4 children who were now in his sole care, 2 biologically his, and 2 who had chosen to stay despite everything. The weight of responsibility fell onto his shoulders like a heavy blanket. But this time, he wasn't going to run. This time, he was going to be present. 6 months had passed since that Christmas night that changed everything. Richard was sitting in his renovated office, now with glass walls that allowed him to see the whole house, never again a closed door separating him from his children. The June sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the desk where he worked, surrounded by the children's drawings taped to the walls, photos of Catherine that had finally been framed and displayed with pride, and a mug with "World's Best Dad" that Lauren had painted for him on Father's Day. He could hear laughter coming from the yard, where the 4 children were playing soccer with the simple ball they had bought in the early hours of that Christmas morning. And the sound was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. Liam no longer stuttered, or at least very rarely. The weekly therapy that all of them attended, Richard included, had helped the boy process the trauma and regain confidence in his own voice. He wore new glasses that actually fit his face, and his hair was well cut, framing a smile that now appeared easily. Lauren was on the school's girls' soccer team and had been made captain, her natural leadership finally having room to flourish without the constant weight of fear. She still woke up with nightmares occasionally, but now she ran to her father's room instead of suffering in silence. And Richard always welcomed her with open arms, no matter the hour. Felix had become the official protector of his younger siblings, using his height and presence to ward off any attempts at bullying at school. He carried the guilt of what he had witnessed and not stopped like an invisible scar. But therapy and the genuine forgiveness from Liam and Lauren were slowly easing that burden. Beatrice and Lauren were inseparable now, true best friends who shared secrets, dreams, and a bond that only those who have weathered storms together can have. The girl had asked to drop her mother's last name and add Miller's, a request he had granted with tears in his eyes and a tight hug. The bedrooms had been completely renovated. Liam and Lauren now each had their own room, spacious and warm, with comfortable beds, decorations they had chosen themselves, and windows that let in sunlight instead of biting cold. But more nights than not, Richard would find all 4 of them sleeping in one of the rooms, piled together like puppies, seeking comfort from one another. He never separated them on those occasions, just covered each one with an extra blanket and left a silent kiss on their sleeping foreheads. The memory room they created with Catherine's belongings had become a sanctuary for healing, a place they could go when they felt her absence without fear or guilt. Isabella had lost full custody of Felix and Beatrice in a devastating hearing where the videos were presented as evidence. The judge had been clear and severe, calling her actions systematic abuse and criminal negligence. She was entitled to supervised visits once a month, but the children rarely agreed to see her. Felix had gone twice in the first few months, seeking some kind of closure or apology that never came. Beatrice hadn't gone once, still processing her mother's betrayal in her childish heart. Isabella was in court-mandated therapy, and Richard genuinely hoped she would find help, not for his sake or the children's, but because no one deserved to live with that much poison inside them. The divorce had been finalized without additional drama. Isabella received nothing but what she had brought into the marriage. The prenuptial agreement proved to be as solid as Richard's lawyers had promised. She had tried to sue for defamation and parental alienation, but the videos and Mrs. Helen's testimony had destroyed any chance of success. She now lived in a small apartment on the other side of town, working as a manager at a smaller bank branch. Her life of luxury and pretense dissolved like snow in the sun. Richard felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a sad emptiness for what could have been if she had chosen love over jealousy and greed. The household routine had completely transformed. Family dinners were sacred, everyone sitting at the table sharing stories from their day. No phones, no television, just conversation and connection. Richard had learned to cook simple meals, and he often invited the children to help, turning the kitchen into a space of laughter and scattered flour instead of a battlefield. Mrs. Helen still worked at the house, but now as part of the family rather than a silent witness to horrors, and she frequently brought her own grandchildren over to play with the kids on weekends. The house was alive in a way it had never been before, filled with good noise and organized chaos. Richard had drastically reduced his work hours, trusting his partner more and learning to delegate what he once considered non-negotiable. He discovered that the world didn't end if he wasn't available 24/7, and that, in fact, his business thrived better when he had balance and mental clarity. His employees commented that he seemed younger, lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. And it had. The weight of guilt, of escape, of denial had been replaced by conscious responsibility and present love, and the difference was transformative. The children still had their hard moments. Liam still had days where the anxiety returned and he would shut down, needing space and patience. Lauren occasionally exploded in disproportionate anger when she felt wronged, years of helplessness finally finding a voice. Felix carried a residual sadness about his mother that sometimes consumed him for days. Beatrice had panic attacks when she heard raised voices, but now they had support, therapy, a present father, and each other. The trauma didn't magically disappear, but it was being processed, integrated, and healed, layer by layer. Richard looked through the glass window of his office and saw Lauren score an improbable goal, celebrating with a ridiculous dance that made everyone laugh. Liam was in goal, his defenses improving week by week as he gained confidence. Felix and Beatrice played together against the twins, a 2-on-2 team that was rarely fair but always fun. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, something that took him a moment to identify because it had been so long since he'd felt it. It was happiness, pure, simple, guilt-free happiness. It was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. That night, after dinner and before bed, Richard gathered all 4 children in the memory room. He was holding a box he had kept hidden since Christmas, waiting for the right moment. That moment had come. "I want to give you something," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They aren't expensive or elaborate gifts. They're letters, one for each of you." He distributed the envelopes, each one addressed by hand with a child's name. Inside were letters Richard had written over the past few months, pouring out his heart, asking for forgiveness, expressing love, and making promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Liam opened his first, his eyes scanning the words as tears began to stream silently. "Dad wrote that he loves me just the way I am," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "That my stutter doesn't define me, that I'm brave and strong and smart." Lauren clutched her letter to her chest before she even finished reading, already crying. "He says Mom would be proud of me, that she sees me from where she is, that it was never my fault." Felix read his in silence, but Richard saw the moment the words about forgiveness, about new beginnings, about being loved unconditionally, hit the boy, his shoulders shaking with contained sobs. Beatrice was the last to finish reading, and when she looked up, she was smiling through her tears. "You wrote that I'm your real daughter now," she said in a shaky voice, "not just on paper, but in your heart." Richard pulled them all into a group hug, all 4 of his children squeezing against him in a mass of arms, legs, and overflowing love. "You were always my real children," he said against their hair. "It just took me too long to have the courage to fully admit it. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere, ever again." As they slowly separated, getting ready for bed, Lauren paused at the door and looked back. "Dad, do you think Mom would have liked how things are now?" Richard thought of the woman he had loved, the warrior who had fought until her last breath to stay with her children, the mother who never gave up even when she was losing. "Your mother would be so proud," he said with absolute conviction. "Not of me. It took me too long to do the right thing, but of you, of how you've overcome terrible things and can still smile, love, and trust. She would be very, very proud." Later that night, with the house finally quiet and all the children sleeping peacefully, Richard returned to the living room where, 6 months earlier, he had witnessed the scene that changed everything. The fireplace was clean now. There was no more smell of burning plastic, no more remnants of destroyed gifts, but he still remembered every detail of that night, and he knew he would never forget it. Not because he wanted to punish himself, but because he needed to remember. He needed to remember the price of absence, the danger of denial, the importance of truly seeing the people we love instead of just looking through them. "The lost gifts were never lost," he murmured to the empty room, the phrase that had become a mantra of transformation. "They were stolen, but we've created new gifts, new dreams, a new family, and this time no one is going to burn them." He looked at the tree in the corner, still up even though it was June, because the children had insisted on keeping it year-round as a symbol of their new beginning. The lights no longer flashed, but they glowed softly, illuminating new photographs hung as ornaments, photos of soccer in the yard, of messy dinners, of group hugs, of genuine smiles, a family rebuilt on the ashes of what was almost destroyed. Richard walked up the stairs slowly, checking each room as he did every night. Liam was asleep, clutching a new teddy bear, his breathing even and peaceful. Lauren had the blanket pulled up to her chin, but her face was relaxed, showing no sign of the nightmares that once plagued her. Felix and Beatrice, in their respective rooms, slept deeply, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. Satisfied, Richard went to his own room, but not before stopping in front of the portrait of Catherine that now hung in the hallway. "I finally did the right thing, my love," he whispered to the photograph. "It took me too long. I failed in terrible ways, but our children are safe now. They're happy, they're healing, and I promise you, on your memory, I will never, ever leave them again." He touched the frame gently before heading to his room. That night, for the first time in years, Richard slept without nightmares, without corrosive guilt, without the crushing weight of absence. He slept as a man at peace with himself, surrounded by the love of a family he had almost lost, but had finally learned to cherish. And outside, through the windows of the mansion in Aspen, the stars shone in the clear sky, silent witnesses to a family that had been broken but was now mending, piece by piece, day by day, with love, patience, and presence. The burned Christmas gifts had been transformed into something far more valuable than toys and expensive clothes. They had been transformed into awareness, into change, into a second chance that not everyone is lucky enough to receive. And Richard Miller, successful businessman but failed father, had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that there is no job more important, no meeting more crucial, and no contract more valuable than being present for the people you love when they need you the most. The greatest Christmas gift isn't bought in stores. It is presence, unconditional love, the certainty that we are not alone in the storms of life. And in that house in Aspen, 6 months after the night that revealed terrible truths, 5 people had finally found that gift. It wasn't perfect, there were still scars and healing work ahead, but it was real, it was genuine, and it was theirs. And sometimes that is more than enough, sometimes that is everything.